Do we owe Docklands an apology? It's been over 25 years since this area started its journey as Melbourne's newest harbourside destination. But was the experiment a success or a failure? This story involves a failed Olympic bid, queer history, a satellite community developed by the Japanese government, planning failures, and a whole lot of concrete. If you're new here, hello, I'm Ken and I make videos about history, infrastructure, architecture, and the environment. Thanks for joining me today. A great source I used in my research was Kim Dovey's Fluid City. I won't get into all of the details today, so if you want to dive deeper, I highly recommend Kim's book. Colonisation transformed the area now known as Docklands from a rich wetland to Victoria Dock, which became one of Australia's largest and busiest ports. By the late 20th century, port activity was moved downstream to the much larger Port of Melbourne, leaving behind 150 hectares of publicly owned land just 600 metres from the CBD. Despite abandonment by the port, the sheds in Victoria Dock remained somewhat alive. Artists took up residence, and, would you believe, some of the biggest raves of the 1990s were held here. A popular spot was Shed 14 on Central Pier, which was a haven for queer people during a time of marginalisation. While the raves were pumping, politicians were considering a Melbourne bid for the 1996 Olympics. Docklands was front and centre as our opportunity to make something other cities could only dream of. A new area on the edge of the water. To understand the development of Docklands, it helps to look briefly at South Bank. Now I know it's not an exact comparison, but South Bank was also a former industrial precinct, and its development, which came only a few years before Docklands, became the model planners initially wanted to follow. The South Bank vision of the 1970s and 80s always intended for the area to complement the city rather than compete with it. It would build on existing cultural assets like the Art Centre to create a lively and fully public waterfront. While there are criticisms of South Bank, most consider it a success. In part, this is because the government planned the precinct in stages and held on to large sections of land along the Yarra, which gave it leverage over how development unfolded. Docklands was a much more difficult challenge. The site was complex. Docklands was physically cut off from the city. Spencer Street Station and its rail yards were a massive barrier, and back then, Footscray Road ran right along the waterfront. Most of the infrastructure was in such a bad state that the cost of repairing it was higher than the value of the land itself. This resulted in early thinking being focused on increasing property values in Docklands. The best property values in the city were on Burke and Collins Streets, but these couldn't logically extend to the harbour because of the rail yards. Remember, this was before Spencer Street Station was redeveloped. It was actually Lonsdale and Latrobe Streets which directly aligned with the harbour. These issues were attempted to be addressed when architect Darryl Jackson created the first vision for Docklands to help with the Olympic bid. It was aspirational, but his plans carried the city's streets over the rail yards and into the harbour precinct. It also moved Footscray Road out of the way and included an Olympic village in what is now Victoria Harbour. Kim Dovey describes this vision. Building heights were to step down from the city to the water to avoid overshadowing of the waterfronts. Waterfront promenades were to be fully public and human-scaled with a rich and varied architecture. The Olympic bid eventually failed, but it had kick-started thinking about what to do with Docklands. The government set up the Docklands Task Force in 1990, and it adopted the principles from Darryl Jackson's vision. The task force was to develop planning strategies and run public consultations. There was quite a bit of community concern and involvement on issues like urban design, public transport, and a western bypass, which is what ended up being the Balti Bridge. But at the same time, a very different vision was emerging. The Committee for Melbourne, a privately funded lobby group, had been promoting its own ideas for Docklands, influenced by a proposal known as the multifunction polis, polis being the Greek word for city. This was a 1987 proposal from the Japanese government for a high-tech city to be built from scratch somewhere in Australia. The Committee for Melbourne put forward a proposal that focused on high-tech industries, leisure and entertainment, in hopes that Docklands might be selected for the multifunction polis. Though this glossy proposal didn't contain any urban design framework. A site north of Adelaide was chosen for the multifunction polis, but it was abandoned by 1998 as it proved highly controversial among the Australian public. Somehow though, the committee's proposal became the preferred model for Docklands going forward. In 1991, the Docklands Authority was established. Unlike the earlier Docklands Task Force, which was planning-based, the Docklands Authority was focused on implementation. The authority had sweeping powers to enter joint ventures, borrow money, and acquire land. Its board was dominated by corporate interests, many linked to the Committee for Melbourne, and there was no direct community representation. Unsurprisingly, the authority adopted the committee's Docklands proposal. By 1992, Victoria was in economic decline and people wanted change, so the Liberal coalition government was elected under Jeff Kennett. There was a strong political imperative to kickstart major projects quickly, and Docklands was in the line of fire. The Docklands plan was soon unveiled, again containing no infrastructure proposals. Under this model, developers were to fund infrastructure themselves, with market forces expected to shape the final outcomes. As you'll see, there were other plans, visions, and concepts over the years, but the broad philosophy behind the Docklands plan was what got us the Docklands of today. Planning language itself began to disappear under the new government. The word planning was replaced with coordination or promotion. At the same time, the government maintained tight control behind the scenes. The Melbourne City Council was excluded from the process, and staff at the Docklands Authority had signed secrecy agreements. The CityLink freeway was also contracted during this period, including plans for what became Bolte Bridge, which was meant to solve the traffic woes of Footscray Road. More on this later. By 1996, developers were still confused. They told government while they appreciated the flexibility, they needed more guidance. So, the Docklands Authority commissioned an urban design vision from ARM architects to address the confusion and generate public credibility. This vision emphasized public access to the waterfront and a generous public realm. While this could have resulted in a great outcome, it instead added to the confusion. Now, multiple plans were operating simultaneously. There was still nothing requiring developers to include public infrastructure, so the ARM vision became more like a marketing tool than anything else, fooling the media and the public into thinking this is how Docklands was developing. In late 1996, a major turning point arrived with the announcement of a private football stadium in Docklands to replace the historic Waverley Park Stadium. Despite the public thinking everything was going well, the stadium contract was the only firm contract for all of Docklands. The stadium site was chosen for its proximity to Spencer Street Station and the waterfront, but it came with some trade-offs, which Docklands continues to suffer from today. The stadium created a massive physical barrier between the city and the harbour and blocked any extension of Lonsdale Street. At the same time, the stadium drew people to the harbour who had never seen it before and raised the everyday awareness of Docklands and the enormous opportunities it presented. It was described as the billboard which sold the broader Docklands development. Though an original promise that Docklands would require little or no public funding was quietly dropped, with the government contributing $71 million for infrastructure to support the stadium and make the deal more viable. This sent a signal to developers that if they held out, the government would eventually pay for key infrastructure. Between 1997 and 1999, multiple development bids were announced, but nearly all collapsed. The exception was Yarra's Edge, on the other side of the Yarra adjoining South Wharf. I was surprised to learn this area is part of Docklands, but maybe not for long. Residents here are trying to get a new postcode. In the late 1990s, transport planning continued to unravel. Rail connections that once served Webb Dock were removed and never properly replaced. In 1998, the Balti Bridge opened, but its gradient was too steep for heavy vehicles, forcing trucks to continue using Footscray Road. In negotiating CityLink, the government agreed to a number of controversial terms, including undertaking roadworks to funnel traffic onto the tollway and narrowing Footscray Road to discourage drivers from avoiding the toll. When it became clear that the bridge wasn't functioning as intended, the government moved quickly to propose a new bypass through Docklands, what would become Wurundjeri Way. It was to be positioned behind the stadium closer to Spencer Street, solving one problem but further disconnecting Docklands from the rest of the city. By the time Wurundjeri Way was complete in 2001, the Kennett government had fallen out of public favour and Labour's Steve Bracks came into the top job. Only a few months into his term, his government was sued by Transurban for nearly $40 million for breaching those terms I mentioned earlier. What a warm welcome! The new government brought a different approach to Docklands. There was a renewed focus on public planning, community consultation, and long-term infrastructure. They significantly increased public investment in Docklands to the tune of around $450 million by 2001. With the removal of through traffic from the waterfront, that space could be opened up to the public. This is how we got the public promenade at Harbour Esplanade and Docklands Park, which extends all the way to Charles Grimes Bridge. We're lucky this plan came to fruition. All of this land had originally been offered up for development, and it was the collapse of the winning bid that allowed this idea to be revived. Other investments included road bridges extending Latrobe and Collins Streets, and a new footbridge from Burke Street. The footbridge was designed by Woodmarsh Architects. I think it used to look really cool. The red fins here initially ran along the whole footbridge on both sides, but the bridge was changed with the construction of Southern Cross Station in 2005. I wonder what happened to the red fins, because wouldn't it be cool if they were reused somewhere in Docklands, maybe to remind us of the early days in its development? By 2002, the first major towers were built in the harbour area of Docklands. The residential New Quay towers ignored suggested height limits, casting shadows over the water for much of the year, and establishing a precedent for the rest of Docklands. If some were allowed to exceed suggested height limits, why couldn't everyone? Just behind New Quay was to be a 24-hour entertainment city. I won't get into all of the details today, but there were some pretty ambitious plans for this spot, all of which failed to go ahead. At one point, there was a plan for a Paramount theme park here. The government offered $14 million, later increased to $40 million to attract a developer to build film and TV studios at the Western Edge. That's what became Docklands Studios. In 2008, the Eastern Edge was developed into what is now the District Shopping Centre, complete with the giant Ferris wheel, which is a hangover from that previous plan for a theme park. The district is a pretty, green, well-lit space, but it does seem to lack the natural flow of people you see in places like Melbourne Central, which thrives because it sits in the everyday movement of the city. By contrast, the district, and Docklands more broadly, feels like you have to deliberately choose to visit, rather than being places you pass through. On top of this, if you're on the Victoria Harbour side of Docklands, it's just as easy, if not easier, to hop on one tram into the heart of the city rather than take multiple trams to get to the district. The Melbourne Star is a 120-metre tall observation wheel that opened in December 2008 and officially closed in September 2021, only to potentially reopen. It became infamous because it was plagued by structural failures, including needing to close only 40 days after it opened and notoriously providing a great view of Melbourne's shipping and rail yards. It seemed to become a symbol for the quote-unquote failure of Docklands that the media and politicians latched onto. Key public infrastructure took far too long to arrive in Docklands. On the northern side of Docklands, Route 35 was extended in 2003 and Routes 70 and 86 were extended in 2005. My visit to Docklands actually took me on my first Route 35 tram, and gosh, it was a charming ride. Almost a decade passed before Routes 11 and 48 were extended between 2009 and 2014. Docklands was included in Melbourne's free tram zone, intended to attract visitors, though in practice this tends to benefit residents more than draw people in. Public transport connections are expected to improve with the development of Fisherman's Bend, but it's still unclear how much that will change the overall feel of Docklands. I'm sure it's welcome nonetheless. Community infrastructure has followed a similar delayed pattern. The library at the dock opened in 2014. It was by far my favourite place to visit, and it seems like a favourite of locals too. It had great friendly staff, places to sit and take in the great view, and lots of activities on. The long-awaited Docklands Primary School opened in 2021 after much lobbying from locals and community groups. I think these facilities highlight how meaningful civic infrastructure ended up being provided by government rather than private developers as intended, and I think this offers some powerful messages as we move forward with other urban renewal projects like Arden, Macaulay and Fisherman's Bend. If you're a resident of Docklands, I'm not trying to offend you. I can absolutely see the appeal. You've got the free tram zone, water views, and an amazing local library. You might be thinking, why does it need to be like everywhere else? But what Docklands offers is predominantly enjoyed by the people who live there. For everyone else, it can feel harder to connect with. I think the reason academics, journalists, and even your everyday Melburnians have strong views about Docklands because it had so much potential. Not every major city has the opportunity to build a new harbourside suburb, and Docklands just doesn't feel like it lived up to expectations. In 2009, demographer Bernard Salt thought that by 2020, Docklands would look like a fusion between, say, Soho in New York and Notting Hill in London. A sort of eclectic, connected, exciting work-living space. Also in 2009, former Minister for Community Services Kay Setches had slightly more realistic expectations, saying she imagined Docklands being alive during the night with people and families. Do you think Docklands lives up to these expectations? Let me know in the comments. I'm no urban planner, but during my visits to Docklands, I observed a few things that highlight why it doesn't feel like it struck the right balance just yet. Access points to Docklands feel strangely disconnected from the ground level, like the elevated deck around the stadium, walking over the hill from Southern Cross down Collins Street, and even the Latrobe Street Bridge. I don't think any of these landmarks give Docklands the connection to the rest of the city that it deserves. The city is about to become even more cut off from Docklands with the approval of enormous new towers fronting the harbour in the stadium precinct. On this note, the overshadowing across the entire Docklands area was pretty off-putting. Many times I stopped to enjoy water views, only to feel like I was being watched by apartment blocks towering over me. Many buildings seem to take up every last bit of space. While I'm all for increasing density, the human scale experience is important too. In the New Quay area, I know they tried to address this by building an extra wide pedestrian promenade, but without vegetation, it just feels concrete and windswept. Sadly, there are a lot of vacant commercial spaces at the base of the apartment blocks along the promenade. Some improvements feel like they've come too late. Greening efforts, of which there have been many, feel like retrofits rather than an integral plan of the original design. No doubt it'll be nice once trees mature. I think we could even make it greener. Efforts to get people to Docklands, like the proposed Little India precinct, might not work. These things seem like they need to happen organically. Dandenong's Little India has been around longer than Docklands itself, and probably deserves the attention more. Lastly, and sadly, Central Pier, one of the only heritage structures in Docklands, and where the famous raves of the 1990s were held, was fully demolished in 2025 because of structural decay. What replaces it will be a reimagining of the precinct, not a reconstruction. In a place often criticised for lacking history and character, I think it's a shame a faithful reconstruction isn't happening, but I do hope whatever is built is done well. Looking back, one of the clearest patterns is how the negotiation process shaped the outcome. Developers often overpromised to secure deals knowing the details could be renegotiated later. The risks they were expected to take were huge, and it's understandable they tried to minimize them. But as the government became more desperate to lock in projects, developers kept pushing for better terms, often with less emphasis on public amenity. Each time the government added new infrastructure, whether this was roads, bridges, or public spaces, it increased land value after the fact, after deals had already been signed, and this reinforced developers' expectations that the government would handle that side of things. Kim Dovey captured this tension perfectly, saying, "To use an architectural analogy, it was as if the plans for an apartment block were developed by tendering it out for design one apartment at a time and hoping that the owners would see a collective interest in providing the lobbies and corridors." Now I know I've been harsh. As I mentioned earlier, there are some really good things here. The issue is less about livability and more about connection, how Docklands relates to the rest of Melbourne, and how welcoming it feels to people who don't live there. Maybe an apology is deserved, but it's a complicated one. Thanks so much for watching. As always, the resources I used to research this video are linked in the description. If you'd like to support the channel and help me keep making videos like this, there's a link below where you can buy me a coffee. Please also consider giving this video a like or subscribing to my channel to see more of our iconic Melbourne. See you in the next one.